Good morning, Pride Doodles. Sorry I'm late. Had some issues. How's everybody doing? Are you ready for chapter 2 of Dada Veda's memoir? There's Jasper right behind me. I've got Luna right next to me. Hi, Loon. Luna's ready for story time. I hope you're all well. So we're about a half an hour late because I had some technical difficulties, but we got it all figured out now. Just gonna wait and let some folks join before we get to reading. Hi, Luna. What a sweet kitty you are. Yeah, that's a good kitty. So there will be a link to purchase Dada Veda's memoir right here in the chat periodically. There will also be a link to my YouTube channel so you can subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you can be notified when I post my content. There is a playlist for this book, so any chapter you may have missed, which is only one so far, you'll be able to watch on my YouTube channel on that playlist. Luna, you're just purring and purring. Yeah, you're happy. She's sitting on the book, just eagerly waiting. Oh, you can't see Jasper Doodle when I do that. So let's see, who's here? Anybody? Dada Veda's here, the author of the memoir that we are reading, From Brooklyn to Benares and Back. We're on chapter 2 today, maybe even 3. We'll see how it goes. Teresa's here. She's eating her breakfast. Carrie's here. Oh, and Luna's here, and she's just purring up a storm. She really is. Let's see if we can get her in the frame a little bit more. Luna, what a sweetie. What a sweet cat. Looney Tunes. All right. So the volume is okay, right? I don't need these earbuds anymore. Let me know if the music gets too loud because I can lower that. Sounds fine? All right. Luna really wants to be pet. And there's Jasper. All right, here we go. Chapter 2, The Path of Bliss. My adventures in California and my reading of spiritual books prepared me for the most important event in my life. Sometime in November 1970, there was a big gathering on the Stanford University campus. Baba Ram Das gave a lecture and he introduced an Indian yogi, Swami Muktananda. Ram Das, Richard Alpert, is an American who was formerly a Harvard University professor, then a psychedelic explorer, and finally an influential and persuasive yogi. The night I saw him, he gave one of his signature lectures, which I believe was later incorporated into his best-selling book, Be Here Now. So good. Swami Muktananda was an Indian guru who was making his first visit to the U.S. He could not speak English, and his lecture was translated. I am writing more than 40 years after the fact, but I remember one thing about the lecture that impressed me, both then and now. He repeated several times during the discourse, "You must meditate. You must meditate." After that lecture, I was convinced that I had to get into meditation and not just dabble in it. I did not connect with Swami Muktananda after the lecture and did not learn meditation from him, but he prepared me for my next step on the spiritual path. About a week after the Ram Das Muktananda lecture, I saw some posters on the Stanford campus with the picture of an Indian yogi that said, "Learn meditation free of charge." That was all I needed to see. I immediately called the telephone number on the poster and said that I wanted to learn meditation. The person answering the call said, "Why don't you attend the lecture first, and then you can learn meditation?" This seemed reasonable, so I went to the lecture with some friends. A short Indian man dressed in a turban and orange robes stood behind a podium. There were lots of young people in attendance, and they were not the suit and tie people who had been at previous meditation lecture that I had attended. Rather, they were the long-haired young people with whom I could identify. I don't remember anything about the lecture, but it was good enough to convince me that I must learn meditation the very next morning. The next morning, I went to work in the library and requested a short leave to learn meditation. My leave was granted, and I headed to a small house located at 365 Grant Avenue in Palo Alto. The living room of that house was packed with people waiting to learn meditation. I approached someone who was in charge of the arrangements and told them that I only had a short leave from work and requested to get some special consideration. They put me at the head of the line, and the next thing I knew, I was alone in a room with the Indian yogi. During my initiation, the monk taught me a mantra, a secret 2-syllable Sanskrit phrase, and told me that by concentrating on it, my mind would gradually expand until one day I would be able to perceive the cosmic consciousness. I went out and sat in the main hall, closed my eyes, and started repeating the mantra in coordination with my breathing as he had taught me. After a few minutes, I started to feel an unusual sense of inner calm and inner well-being, as if I had somehow stepped into another dimension that I hadn't even known existed. My God, I thought, this stuff actually works. Cosmic consciousness, here I come. Prior to this initiation, I had tried to meditate following advice from books or casual instructions given by friends and acquaintances, but I could never really get into any of these practices because I was unsure if I was doing the right practice or whether I was doing any of the practices properly. But now I had the feeling that I had learned a practice that I would be able to stick with and master. That feeling proved to be correct. After my initiation, I did not miss a day, practicing 2 times a day, then 3 times a day, and then even more. This continues to this very day. A few days after my initiation, I attended a retreat that had been organized for the initiates from the San Francisco Bay Area. It was a huge gathering in a state park or some other similar site, I can't remember exactly. I entered the main hall where everyone was seated and listened to incredible singing and chanting, and immediately felt that I was really in the right place, the place that I had been restlessly searching for in my travels. Following the retreat, I began to meditate twice a day and did whatever I could to learn more about the teachings of the Ananda Marga Yoga Society, the official name of the organization in the U.S. at that time. Ananda Marga is a Sanskrit term that means the path of bliss. Going deeper into meditation. Immediately after initiation, I began meditating twice a day, and I also adopted a vegetarian diet. Not only was it a vegetarian diet, but it was the special yogic or sattvic, pure vegetarian diet that excluded eating onions, mushrooms, and garlic. I still went to work every day in the Stanford University Library, but every evening when I got home, I did my meditation. I was not sure if I was getting very far in the practice, but I did it diligently, night and day. My friend Jan, or is it Jan, and several other people in my little community also were initiated into the Ananda Marga meditation practice, and we sometimes did meditation together. A few of us would visit the monk who had taught us meditation as often as we could. We also attended the collective meditation sessions held in the Stanford Student Union. During one of my visits to the monk's residence in Palo Alto, I met a young artist who had just been to India. He told me that Ananda Marga in India was a vast organization with many social projects and even their own political party. This intrigued me. I was happy to know that I was part of a large movement that could help change society. While visiting the yoga house, I saw for the first time on the meditation altar a photo of Sri Sri Ananda Murti, the founder of Ananda Marga. A good-looking, clean-shaven man with folded hands. His civil name was Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, but everyone called him Baba. This created confusion for some of us because we were not sure if he was the same Baba as the famous Babaji in Yogananda's book. Very soon, I would learn more about the Baba of Ananda Marga. One day, the monk announced that he would give a special course for those who wanted to assist him by becoming yoga teachers. I signed up along with a few of my friends. It wasn't really a course. All we had to do was go to the small house where the monk was staying and meditate with him at 5 a.m. for 1 hour straight. Previous to this, I was barely able to sit for 20 to 30 minutes. On the last day of the course, he then showed us which yoga postures to do and to teach. He also said that now that we were going to be yoga teachers, we should meditate 3 times a day instead of the customary 2 times. It's Jan. I knew it. He's from Holland, so it's Jan. Thank you. Immediately thereafter, whenever I was working at the library, I would divide my lunch hour into 2 parts. During the first part of the lunch hour, I would sit on a bench or on the campus lawn and meditate, and during the second part, I would eat my lunch. Before going to work, I meditated, and immediately upon returning home from work, I meditated again. Once again, I was not sure if I was making much progress in meditation, but I was certainly doing more of it. Now that I was qualified to teach yoga classes, I soon got my chance. Sometime around February of 1971, my birth month, another retreat was organized. This time, it was in a campsite near Santa Cruz. Once again, several hundred young men and women from all over Northern California attended. The monk in charge of the retreat organized a midnight meditation on the first night, so we dozed off getting ready for that meditation. While I was resting, someone tapped my shoulder and asked me if I would teach a yoga class the next morning. I said yes and got some more rest before the midnight meditation. The next morning, the organizers divided the retreat participants into 2 large groups. I was assigned to one of them in a large open area and taught my first Ananda Marga yoga class to about 150 people. Luna, want to come back? Want to come back? Everybody's just looking at your little booty right now. A life-changing event. After my second retreat, I continued meditating regularly, 3 times a day. Sometime in late February or early March 1971, I heard that the monk was going to conduct a special intensive course. I was not sure what this course would entail, but some of the Margis, as the members of Ananda Marga are called, said that he would teach more lessons in meditation and that I would get high. This sounded interesting, so I got ready to apply for the 2-week course. My intention was to take the course and then go back to my friends in the Palo Alto area and continue with the work of building our community and eventually move to Oregon to set up a rural cooperative community. However, when I went to see Dada, the Ananda Marga monks are addressed as Dada, which means respected elder brother, to talk about my application to attend the course. My plans and my life changed. When I entered the room, Dada asked me what I did. I said that I worked in the library at Stanford University. He looked at me and said, "You work in the library?" I had a big beard and long hair and was dressed in blue denim overalls and a t-shirt, very unlike the typical library assistant. Then he said, "After you complete this course, can I send you anywhere in the U.S. to work for our mission?" I thought about it for only a few seconds before replying yes. That yes was to change the entire course of my life. No longer was I thinking of returning to Palo Alto and my old plans. I was ready to help build Ananda Marga in the U.S. and beyond. U Seminar and Baba Nam Kevalam. Shortly after my interview with Dada, I got ready to attend the U Seminar. U was the acronym for the nonprofit organization Youth for an Orderly Universe, which Dada had just set up. I never liked that name because it sounded goody-goody. I was in a more revolutionary mood at the time, but I went to the seminar to go deeper into meditation. There were over 60 participants for the 2-week program, which took place at a campsite located in mountains outside of LA. We meditated many hours a day. I seem to remember the number of hours being 8, but I could be wrong about that. In addition to the meditation, Dada gave classes on Ananda Marga philosophy, and I was able to grasp enough of it to be able to start teaching it as soon as I left the seminar. We did a lot of chanting and singing during our stay. Many of the songs were Hindu chants that have become very popular in the Kirtan movement in American yoga circles. We were also introduced to the chant Baba Nam Kevalam and in an accompanying dance that went along with it. This is the Kirtan mantra of Ananda Marga. Kirtan, or more properly spelled, Kirtan, means chanting the name of God. It was first popularized in India 500 years ago by the saint Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Today in India, this kind of chanting is very common in temples, in villages, and in the city streets. We were told that in the last quarter of 1970, Ananda Marga's guru had introduced the mantra Baba Nam Kevalam, and that its meaning was only the name of the most beloved. I had heard this mantra a few months earlier at the yoga house in Palo Alto, but then it was not a central part of the practice. The dance that went with the mantra was very simple. We were taught to hold our arms in the air above our heads and alternately tap one toe and then the other behind the heel of the opposite foot in time to the music. Our instructors, who included some Americans who had recently been in India, told us that the chanting would elevate our minds and help us to detach ourselves from the cares of the world and the other thoughts which would disturb meditation. We began dancing in all different directions, but they soon had us dance in orderly rows and in the same rhythm. I quickly discovered that the dancing and chanting made it easier for me to concentrate afterward in meditation. When the seminar came to an end, Dada addressed us all with a list in his hands. On the list was the name of each participant, and next to it was the place where each of us was being sent to propagate Ananda Marga. It was an incredible list. People were designated for places like Alaska, Hawaii, Mississippi, Delaware, just about every state in the Union. What is amazing about this whole thing is that we were all hippies with barely any resources. We got a packet that fit in an 8.5 by 11-inch envelope consisting of some mimeographed pages about Ananda Marga philosophy and a photo of Dada to be used for posters to advertise lectures and classes. With this packet under our arms and just a few dollars in our pockets, we seminar participants bravely hit the road, ready to set up meditation centers all over the country. With our limited means, most of the volunteers had to hitchhike to their appointed destinations. Finally, my name was called and my destination was announced: Santa Monica, California. This was not too far from the campgrounds and seemed to be something manageable. So I too left the campgrounds with my backpack, my Ananda Marga information packet, and lots of youthful energy and enthusiasm. Don't touch the Swami. Prior to the training session, Dada had already given a number of lectures in the Los Angeles area and had several contacts there. I was given the name of one young man who would be able to put me up. He lived in the hills above Santa Monica in a small house with a beautiful view. I stayed with him for a few days, but then he told me that his mother was coming back, so I would have to leave. I wasn't prepared for that, but there was nothing I could do. I went out to nearby Venice Beach to see what I could find. I went into a health food shop on the main street, and inside I saw a sign that read Om Yoga. It looked promising. I copied the address on the poster and found that it was only a few blocks from the health food shop. It turned out to be on a street that ended where the beach began. It was a beautiful location. I went up to the door of the apartment and knocked, but no one was there. I peered through the windows and then I tried the door and found it open. I looked inside and saw that the main living room was decorated in the style of an ashram. No furniture, a carpet, and something like an altar at one end. It looked peaceful and nice. Although the door was not locked, I thought it best to wait outside on the porch until the owner came back. Finally, someone came. He was a young man who was keenly interested in various spiritual topics. When I explained what I was doing, he said, "I don't really agree with your philosophy, but I will give you a place to stay." He showed me a little alcove and said I could stay there. I rolled out my sleeping bag and was really content with my new home. Now that I had a secure base, I plunged myself into the work. I found a place in a municipal building located on the Venice boardwalk and was able to set up yoga classes there. Then I took the small photo of Dada and made a poster advertising those classes. After a short time, I learned that a new acharya, a spiritual teacher, had been posted to take the place of the previous monk. I also found out that he would visit Los Angeles, and I began to arrange lectures for his coming visit. On the day of his arrival, I went to the LA airport with a few friends to meet him. We had difficulty at first finding him, but after a time we spotted our orange-robed monk, and took him back to the beachfront apartment where I was staying. To my amazement, the apartment was already filled with people interested in meditation. Somehow the word got out that an Indian yogi was coming. In those days, that was all that it took to gather a crowd. Dada Varananda was the new teacher. He was about 30 years old and had previously been an engineer in India. He spoke in an accent that was hard to understand, but he had a lot of energy and dynamism. He gave public lectures, which I had organized in the few weeks prior to his arrival, and following the lectures, many people came to learn meditation. In fact, so many people came that it was impossible for him to do anything but teach meditation. He would be seated in one room while I would remain by the door preparing the people. I explained as much as an assistant could before sending the student into the room to learn his or her particular mantra and meditation method from Dada. He started in the morning and then came out for noon meditation and lunch and went back for another full session in the afternoon. Dada adjusted pretty quickly to conditions in America, but there was still culture clash. During one of the afternoon teaching sessions, he came out of the room looking shaken. He explained to me that one young woman had just reached out to embrace him. While women hugging and embracing men is nothing new in California, it is a shocking thing for an Indian monk. That's why Dada looked at me and said sternly, "Before sending them into the room, tell them, don't touch the Swami." Many people learned meditation during these visits, and it was very inspiring to be a part of it. I remember just before Dada was ready to leave, he embraced me and said, "Think of him with every breath." He was referring to Baba, but frankly, up to that time, I did not have this kind of relationship with the Ananda Marga guru, and that sentence didn't mean much to me. First big retreat, realizing Baba's presence. After Dada Yatishvarananda left Los Angeles, I continued with the work of getting Ananda Marga established. Although the apartment where we welcomed Dada was nice, it was time to move on to something else. While I was working at the Stanford University Library, prior to plunging it into this new line of work, I had been earning a regular salary. Part of it I used for my basic monthly expenses, and the rest was pooled with the other members of our community into a fund that would later be used to buy land in Oregon. When I left the community, my friends decided to refund the amount that I had contributed over the previous 15 months. This refund enabled me to work for Ananda Marga and rent a building that would serve as our Jagriti. Jagriti means place of awakening, or is it Yagriti? And is the term used for Ananda Marga centers that are home to collective meditation. Our first Jagriti was not a palace. It was an old wooden house on Pacific Avenue in Venice, not far from the beach. 5 or 6 Margis moved into the house with me, and we had a small spiritual community. This happened sometime in June of 1971. The next big event looming on the horizon was Ananda Marga's first national retreat, which was going to be held in a church campground near Wichita, Kansas in July. However, I almost was diverted from attending it. One of the Margi brothers living in the house with us had some friends who were in India. They wrote letters to him saying that in India they had met a 14-year-old Messiah. This 14-year-old, they said, was the Lord of the universe. Well, that was confusing. Although I hadn't really heard much about Baba, I assumed that if anyone was the Lord of the universe, it would be him and not this 14-year-old from India, who later became famous as Maharaji, guru of the Divine Light mission. Just at this time, another person arrived on the scene. He was Bill Bowen, or Virupaksha, his spiritual name. Jagriti, pronounced with a J, but no accent on the second syllable. Jagriti? Jagriti. Am I right? Jagriti? Okay. Bill Bowen, or Virupaksha, was a British artist married to an American, and he had just been in India enjoying the company of Baba. He told us many fascinating stories about his time with Baba, and this helped to keep me on track to attend the retreat in Kansas. My friend Ken, however, chose to join his friends who had become close disciples of the 14-year-old guru, and he soon left Ananda Marga. He became a disciple of the boy guru, who was scheduled to arrive in Los Angeles just as we were leaving for the retreat. A few days before the retreat, we organized ourselves into cars and got ready to travel from LA to Kansas. We stopped in some campgrounds along the way. One evening I went out to meditate, and then a complaint came from the owner of one of the trailers near where I was meditating. They said, "We don't know what he's doing, but tell him not to do it here." We finally reached the Assembly of God campgrounds near Wichita, where Margis poured in from all parts of the country. It was a retreat filled with devotional songs and Baba Nam Kevalam chanting. Although the retreat was led by Dada Yatishvarananda, we had just finished a grueling tour of several American cities where he had taught thousands of people meditation. Some of the stars of the retreat were the American Margis who had recently returned from India. The stories that they told were incredible and fascinating. An amazing story was told by Pramil, a tall brother from Wichita, Kansas, who became the first president of our association. He was in India during the Sadhana year, also known as the Year of Demonstrations, and he attended many darshans with Baba. During that special period, Baba illustrated many yoga techniques and demonstrations in which some lucky disciples got to experience higher states of consciousness. Pramil participated in one of the demonstrations. Baba said to him, "Pramil, are you an ordinary little boy, or are you an extraordinary little boy?" Pramil thought about it and knew that whatever he said, he would probably be wrong, but to be on the safe side, he said, "I am an ordinary little boy." Baba noted his answer and then told Pramil to sit on his lap. It is hard to imagine how the tall Pramil could fit on the lap of Baba, who was only 5'3", but apparently this is what happened. Sadhana, sadhana. Thank you, Dada Veda, for the phonetics. I really need the help. Baba then called for one of the monks to sit in a meditation posture just in front of him and Pramil. Baba gave his stick to Pramil and told him to touch the monk just between the two eyebrows where the nose begins. This spot is sometimes called the third eye, or more correctly, the Trikuti, 3 hills, and is the gateway to the yoga chakra that controls the mind. Trikuti, 3 hills. When Pramil touched the monk at the point indicated by Baba, the monk went into a state of deep meditative trance, samadhi, and fell backward. Baba then said to Pramil, "Are you an ordinary little boy, or are you an extraordinary little boy?" One day during the retreat, Pramil and the other Margis who had seen Baba started telling their stories. Trikuti, it is on the second syllable. Trikuti, okay. Thank you. One day during the retreat, Pramil and the other Margis who had seen Baba started telling their stories. Pramil's narrative was deep and moving, and he concluded by saying, "Baba is always with you." When he said this, something happened to me. I was seated in a meditation posture, and I closed my eyes. Scenes started to race through my head. I saw myself wandering down the main street of Venice, worrying about where I would live next. Then I saw myself walking into the health food shop, where I saw a yoga poster with an address. Next, I saw myself finding that perfect little apartment that was to be the scene of Dada Varananda's successful first visit to LA. I saw all of this in my mind, and then realized that it was Baba who had arranged it all, that he was showering me with unconditional love and support. When I realized the kind of love that Baba was giving me, I burst into tears. At this point, everybody got up to sing and dance Baba Nam Kevalam, but I could not move from the floor. After a few minutes, I composed myself and got up to join the others in the dance. From that point on, I realized that Baba was not simply a man who lived in India. He was my guru, and his spiritual presence was all around me, guiding me onwards. This was an important milestone on my spiritual journey. From that point onward, Dada Yatishvarananda's advice, "Think about him with every breath," began to make a lot of sense. Later, I came to know that several other people had experiences like this during that particular session of storytelling, chanting, and meditation. For the first few days of the Kansas retreat, I was in complete bliss. I didn't have a care in the world. But then I remembered a task that the Margis in LA had given me. They wanted me to bring back books from the retreat. I began to think about which books I should get, and my mind was diverted from the bliss of chanting and dancing. I brought back a good supply of books printed in India and written by Baba, and a new book, The Path of Bliss, written by 2 American disciples who explained Ananda Marga's philosophy in a way that would be understandable to people in the West. Cleaning up our act. One of the small footnotes to the first nationwide retreat in Kansas was Dada Y's attempt to change the image of his volunteer workers. Most of us came from the hippie movement with long hair, and the men, including me, had beards. Dada Y often said that he didn't like the hippie lifestyle, and at the retreat he urged us to cut our hair and get more trim. One day there was a mass session of hair cutting and beard trimming. I took part in this, and for the next few years, while working as an Ananda Marga volunteer in the U.S., I was beardless with a mustache and normal-length hair. But Dada couldn't escape all aspects of the hippie subculture. He often told me that he didn't like how the hippies hitchhiked all over California. One day, we got ready to go to a lecture that I had organized for him at a college in Santa Monica. The college was a few miles from our house in Venice, and we planned to go there by car. We walked to where our car was parked, but the driver all of a sudden discovered that he had misplaced his keys. I looked at my watch and saw that we did not have any time to spare. So while the driver rushed back to our house to look for his keys, I quickly grabbed Dada and took him to the main road. I stuck out my thumb and flagged down someone who was driving towards the college. Dada and I got into the car, and the driver was very friendly. He asked what we were doing, and I said that we were going to give a lecture on meditation at the college in Santa Monica. He asked who was giving the lecture, and I pointed to Dada, who was sitting sheepishly beside me, frustrated by having had to resort to the hippie mode of transportation. When we got to the college, we found the door to the lecture room locked. I told Dada to wait in front of the room while I searched for someone who could unlock the door. I dashed around the college, and it took some time to find the person who could open the door. When I finally arrived back at the lecture room, Dada was not there.
I looked out to the college courtyard, and there he was, giving his lecture outdoors with a throng of students seated on the grass, listening intently. Work in LA. After the retreat in Kansas, I was really ready to work wholeheartedly for Ananda Marga. I began teaching yoga classes in several localities in the Los Angeles area. I taught yoga postures and introduced the universal mantra Baba Nam Kevalam and some basic meditation. I'm not sure how the students felt about the whole thing, but I really enjoyed these classes and experienced a lot of bliss both during and immediately after. In fact, it was this elevating experience that propelled me towards my eventual vocation as a full-time monk and teacher of meditation. In addition to the yoga and meditation class in Venice, I also taught in Pasadena, Long Beach, and several other places in the sprawling Los Angeles metropolitan area. Some of my students went on to learn meditation from Dada Veda. One of these was Arjuna, a Los Angeles school teacher who came to my first classes near the Venice boardwalk. He would later become the pillar of the Ananda Marga community in Los Angeles for many years afterward. We tried to spread the spiritual message in many ways. One day, a few of us heard that there would be a community festival in a Los Angeles park. We went there to see if we could be part of the program. An elevated performance area was set up in the park, and we managed to get on the bill of performers and presenters. We were going to chant some Indian spiritual songs. Just before we were to go on stage, the master of ceremonies asked me, "What is the name of your group?" I thought about it for a few seconds, wildly grabbed the first thought that came to me, and then replied, "The Ananda Marga Satvik Kirtan Band." He turned around and faced the audience and said, "I can't pronounce their name, but here they are." The audience liked our short performance, and we returned home satisfied with a nice outing. Liberation of self and service to humanity is the motto of Ananda Marga. Liberation of self refers to the spiritual side of life, the idea that humans should pursue practices that will bring them union with the supreme consciousness, God. The other part of the motto refers to social service. We should render selfless service to society, which is just what the folk singer Lou Gottlieb had told me a few years earlier. In India, Ananda Marga was engaged in widespread social service with hundreds of schools, medical clinics, and children's homes. In Los Angeles, we did our best to follow this example. Members of our small unit visited a home for children with disabilities and performed music there. The Venice Beach area, where our yoga house was located, was home to an active alternative and radical community, and I attended meetings that they held to coordinate various activities. I participated in the local food cooperative, which was a large buying club working out of various temporary venues, and joined some co-op members in other social activities, including visits to prisoners in local jails. I also taught yoga to people in an alcohol treatment program at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Los Angeles. A few Ananda Marga members even set up a small daycare center in Venice, trying to fulfill our guru's wish for the founding of spiritual schools around the world. Though our daycare center was quite modest with only a few children, I remember one of the community activists who said, "So many people talked about setting up a daycare center, but Ananda Marga actually did it." It's not very ladylike, Loon. My life is really good. In high school, I was a reporter for the school newspaper. I continued this in college as well and also joined the editorial staff in my senior year. I had an aptitude for writing and publishing, and when I got into Ananda Marga, I applied it to the job at hand. We had a large mailing list because many people had learned meditation from the two monks who had visited Los Angeles. I started to produce a monthly newsletter that contained helpful tips for meditation and excerpts from Baba's writings. It was printed on an old mimeograph machine that a local person made available to us whenever we needed to produce a newsletter. As the months passed, the newsletter became more sophisticated and started to take the shape of a small monthly magazine. It was still mimeograph, but I gave it a grandiose name. I called it Sadvipra. Sadvipra is the name that Baba gave to the ideal moral and spiritual leaders who he said would emerge in the near future to guide humanity to a bright destiny. With the yoga classes, social service activities, and newsletter publishing, I was fairly busy and time went by quickly. All of these activities were very fulfilling, and one day during 1971, I walked down the boardwalk at Santa Monica Beach and watched the sun sinking into the Pacific Ocean. While gazing at the setting sun and at the hills and mountains that join the ocean at the horizon, I had a feeling that now, at the age of 25, my life was really good. I was almost floating down the boardwalk with the same euphoric steps that I had taken on the streets of LA after my first yoga class. Now I need just a quick break. So don't go away. I'll be right back. Alexa, turn your volume up to 7. Alexa, turn your volume down to 4. I'm back. Hope y'all are enjoying it so far. Luna seems to be enjoying it. Where can I read more about this, Krishna? On the spiritual path, euphoria doesn't last forever, and I still had to face some significant obstacles. One of the biggest problems in my life from 1968 onwards was the draft for military service. When I graduated from college, my student deferment expired immediately. By this time, I was fully convinced that the war in Vietnam was immoral and that I didn't want to fight in it. But it was not so easy to get out of it. I was called to 2 military physicals, but was thrown out of them because I disrupted their orderly procedures. If you have ever heard Arlo Guthrie's song, Alice's Restaurant, you'll have an idea of what my first 2 physicals were like. If you haven't heard the song, then suffice it to say, when the Army encounters a long-haired hippie, things can get strange. Getting ejected from 2 physicals delayed the whole process, and I went on exploring the spiritual path and getting into Ananda Marga work. In fact, I got so involved with the propagation of Ananda Marga that I more or less forgot about this problem and wasn't even aware of further calls to appear for physicals. One day, someone knocked on the door of the ramshackle Venice Jagrati. Or was it Jagrati? No, Trikudi. Jagrati. Trikudi. Jagrati. One day, someone knocked on the door of the ramshackle Venice Jagrati. It was an FBI officer. I asked him if he would like to come in, but he said no, that we should talk in his car. We got into his car, and he said that I was again called for a physical, and told him that I would go and that there wouldn't be any problem this time. I went to the physical, and true to my word, I went through all the procedures in an orderly way, and was deemed fit to serve in the military. In fact, they were going to administer the oath of induction immediately. But just before they were to begin, the presiding officer said, "Is there anyone here who is going to refuse induction?" I raised my hand and was quickly separated from the rest of the group. They told me that if I wanted to refuse induction, I would have to speak with the commanding officer of the base first. I was taken to a room where an African-American officer was seated. He seemed well-educated and intelligent. He started a discussion and said, "The philosophy of pacifism is not very logical." I told him that I was not a pacifist, but that I didn't think the war in Vietnam was moral. I elaborated by saying, 3,500 years ago, there was a great spiritual leader named Krishna, and he fought in a moral war. But yours is not a moral war, so I won't fight in it. He listened to me intently and then told me that I was free to leave. As I walked out of the door, he asked, "Where can I read more about this Krishna?" After that, I never heard from the military, the FBI, or anyone else about these matters. I just went on doing my work with Ananda Marga. Over the years, I attributed this to Baba's grace. I was doing his work, and he had somehow helped me to continue doing it. Many years later, I recounted this story to an old college friend, and he listened and then said, "The explanation is easy. The officer was impressed with you and just shuffled your papers to the bottom of the pile." Whatever the reason, a huge problem had been lifted from my shoulders. The first Jagriti in Beverly Hills. Not long after we moved into the rented house in Venice Beach and proclaimed it an Ananda Marga Jagriti, I received a visit from a Margi from Philadelphia. He seemed to have a lot of experience in Ananda Marga, and when he saw the Jagriti, he said, "Yeah, it's a hole in the wall, just like the others." His description of the Venice house was not far off the mark. It was an old wooden clapboard building that had certainly seen better days. I didn't think it was that bad, but I was curious to know about the second part of his statement. I hadn't seen another Ananda Marga centers except for the small rented house in Palo Alto, and I wanted to know why they had to be holes in the wall. He explained that we didn't get donations of big houses with swimming pools and other amenities, as some religious and spiritual organizations did. "It's just not our style," he said. I understood what he was trying to say, but I still aspired to one day get something better than the house in Venice. After some time, we had to move out of the house because the landlady was not happy having a spiritual community living on her property. She told us that we would have to find another place. In the meanwhile, I continued teaching yoga around Los Angeles. Joining me during those first months was Nasikita Steve Rickheimer. Steve was a graduate student at Stanford University and was among the first Americans to take initiation into Ananda Marga. He went to India and met Baba and even received his spiritual name from Baba directly. Now he wanted to take some time off to help spread Ananda Marga, so he joined me at the Venice Jagriti and stayed for several months. In Venice, Steve and I gave yoga and meditation classes at the municipal building on the boardwalk. When we taught the classes, we wore special clothing, loose white Indian pajama pants called yogi pants, and a matching Indian kurta. After we finished the first class at the municipal center and got ready to walk out on the boardwalk, Steve asked me, "Is it all right to go out on the boardwalk dressed like this, or should we change back into our regular clothes?" "Believe me," I said, "it doesn't matter what you wear. Nobody will blink an eye here." Indeed, the boardwalk was well known for all manner of eccentric behavior, and still is. In the 1950s, it was a home to the beat poets, and in the late 60s, it became a hippie hangout. Two yogis walking down the boardwalk, garbed in Indian clothes in 1971, blended right in with the scenery. We also taught yoga together at the East-West Cultural Center in downtown LA. One evening, a woman and her husband joined the class. When they came back the next week, the woman was effusive with her praise. "My husband was able to sleep soundly for the first time in years," she said. "We have a house that was damaged in the earthquake. If you two can fix it up, then you can use this as your yoga center." A few months earlier, a strong earthquake centered in Los Angeles' San Fernando Valley had shaken the region and many homes had been damaged. I have never been handy with tools and didn't think I would be up to the job of fixing the house. In addition, I found the couple, particularly the woman, somewhat strange, so I didn't want to take part in the project. Steve, however, was very good with this kind of work, and his ears perked up when the woman told him that the house was in Beverly Hills. It was not actually in Beverly Hills, where tourists come on a daily basis to visit the mansions of movie stars. Rather, it was in a hilly area just north of the Beverly Hills municipality. The homes there were upper middle class, split-level dwellings, not much different from the homes in suburbs all around the country. But the postal address of Beverly Hills, California, gave it a certain mystique. So we finally accepted the offer and moved into the Beverly Hills house. When I gave the news to our headquarters in Wichita, one of the young volunteers congratulated us on this feat. Steve and I then began the work of fixing the house. The earthquake had left large cracks in the living room walls and in a few other rooms. We plastered the cracks and repainted the walls, and in a few weeks the house was looking pretty good. It was at this point that the woman appeared at the house one evening and said, "My husband doesn't agree with this arrangement. You will have to leave immediately." My initial misgivings about the deal were confirmed, but we did not have much time to think about it. We called up a Margie friend, Webster Phillips, who worked in the movie industry as a makeup artist. He promptly pointed out the obvious. "You got the place looking pretty good," he said, "and now she wants to throw you out." Webster owned a trailer in the San Fernando Valley and told us that we could stay there until we found something more suitable. So we threw our things together and moved from the heights of prestigious Beverly Hills to the down-to-earth valley, where we stayed in Webster's tiny trailer. Eventually, we found a modest apartment not far from the ocean in Santa Monica that became our new Ananda Margi Jagrati. More retreats and more practices. While working in LA and later in other places in the US, my life was punctuated by large retreats every 6 months, one in midsummer and one during the last week of the year. These retreats were held in the center of the US, usually in Kansas. At the retreat held at the end of 1971, I was introduced to some new practices. We learned that Baba had revived Tandava, a dance that dates back to the time of Shiva, 5000 BC. In ancient times, it was practiced by warriors because the dance is invigorating and increases courage. The dancers hold a knife in their right hand and a skull or snake in their left hand. The knife symbolizes life, and the snake or skull symbolizes death. The dance is a celebration of the victory of life over death. Tandava was demonstrated at the retreat by Margis who had learned it in India. After watching the demonstration, we gave it a go. First, we had to jump up once, hitting buttocks with our heels, and then landing on our toes while keeping our arms extended horizontally. We jumped again, and then we began bouncing on one foot and then the other while lifting the other leg in the air above our waists. I soon got the hang of it and really enjoyed it. Some of the Margis from Los Angeles who had accompanied me to the retreat said that I did it well. At this retreat, we were also introduced to a set of practices known as the 16 points. It included dietary guidelines, fasting, moral precepts, and meditation. The Ananda Marga path had become more rigorous, but I was up for the challenge and began to learn and follow the new instructions. Tandava. Thank you, Dada Veda. I maybe should get a glossary from you for any words that are coming up. Tandava. And I'm going to have to practice these words too. Love is all there is. In the summer of 1972, we again held our nationwide retreat in Kansas. This time it was at the fairgrounds in the city of Hutchinson. Once again, several hundred people attended. They came from all over the U.S. and also from Canada, and we enjoyed a busy program of chanting, meditation, and lectures on yogic philosophy. Our retreat coincided with the Independence Day celebration, and the city of Hutchinson invited us to send people to march in the 4th of July parade. I was busy and decided not to attend the parade. Dada Y and a large delegation of Margis headed to the place where the parade was to begin. Some of them traveled in a converted school bus that was painted white with red lettering proclaiming Ananda Marga Yoga Society of California on both sides. When the delegation got back from the parade, I asked Dada how it went. He said that when he looked at the people lining the parade route and then looked at his Margis, who despite his exhortations still looked like California hippies, he began wondering how he was going to explain this to the Midwesterners. And then it flashed in his mind, Baba Nam Kevalam, love is all there is. The bus might have looked strange. The Margis didn't look anything like the other people attending the parade, and the mantra they were singing was certainly foreign, But love is all there is was something that everyone could understand. The Margis started singing Baba Nam Kevalam, love is all there is, and the crowd applauded. This loose translation of Baba Nam Kevalam had sticking power, and even today, if you ask most Margis what this mantra means, they will simply say, love is all there is. Leaving Los Angeles. Tandava, not Tandava. Okay, thank you. Tandava. In August of 1972, my life was about to change. Dada Y came to Los Angeles again, and this time he invited me to join the national office of Ananda Marga in Wichita. He knew that I was skilled at producing newsletters and that I also had some knowledge of newspaper production from my college days, so he invited me to come to Wichita to publish a newspaper for Ananda Marga. In India, Ananda Marga published newspapers and magazines in several Indian languages. This was a program that Baba considered extremely important. So it was easy to understand why Dada wanted me to leave Los Angeles and start work on the newspaper. The Margis of Los Angeles took me to the bus station, and I felt satisfied with the work that we had done in LA. I got on the bus and headed towards Kansas, ready to face a new challenge. After 3 eventful years in California, I was leaving and was not to return there for many, many years. And that concludes chapter 2. Now, should we vote on whether or not to go ahead and do chapter 3? What do you think? You know, we got a late start today. I'm willing to do another chapter if y'all are willing to listen. So it's Jagrati, Tandava, and what was the other word? Trakudi. Sadhana. Tandava, sadhana. All right. Well, what do you think? Do you think it's too long? There's a lot of pictures. Do you think it's too long, Dada? Let's do it. Here's chapter 3. Okay, now how do we say this word? Is it Sadvipra or is it Sadvipra? Sadvipra? Savipra. Sadvipra. Okay. Savipra? Sadvipra. Okay. After arriving in Wichita, Kansas, I was uncertain about what was going to happen next. I was now in the headquarters of Ananda Marga in the U.S., and it was a living situation unlike any I had previously been in. Our building was a 2-story suburban home with trees out front and a park-like cemetery in the back. This typical American home looked ordinary on the outside, but inside it had been transformed into an ashram and workplace. I lived in a former attic area. We didn't have much furniture, so we slept in sleeping bags on the carpeted floor, but I really liked living in the attic because I could gaze out at treetops from all sides of the building through the gable windows. our Wichita office staff. I am standing just to the right of the word Marga. There's Dada Veda. What used to be a garage was now an office with several desks. I was given one desk, a filing cabinet, and a typewriter, and with this equipment I was going to produce a national newspaper for this new organization. On one of my first days in Wichita, we were sitting around the kitchen table, and Dada Y introduced me to some of the people there who had not yet met me. Previously, Vishvarup, my Sanskrit name at that time, was living in LA using his savings to support himself, Dada explained to everyone at the table. Now his savings have been exhausted, and he is living on Baba Nam Kevalam. While I was in Wichita, my expenses were paid by Ananda Marga, but when I went on other assignments, both in the U.S. and abroad, I had to fend for myself, and many times over the next 40 years, I felt I was getting by only with the grace of an unseen hand, or, as Dada put it, through the strength of the mantra of love, Baba Nam Kevalam. Wichita Social Service. There were a number of young volunteers in our Wichita office. A few of them managed the office, maintaining correspondence with a movement that now had branches around the country. I was there to work on the newspaper, and we also had a young printer and an accountant who were going to launch a commercial print shop. Several Margis also joined us who wanted to concentrate on social service activities, working under the banner of Ananda Marga's education, relief, and welfare section. My colleagues who specialized in social service organized a number of activities. They visited homes for children with disabilities, visited prisons, and signed up as assistants with the Red Cross. In the event of an emergency, they would join well-equipped Red Cross disaster relief teams. I took part in some of these activities, playing music for children, and was also on standby in case of a natural calamity. I played guitar and sang at outings to homes for children with disabilities. We had a great sense of camaraderie. We sang and meditated together every day. We took part in social service activities as a group, and we even played sports together. At one point, we decided that one of the best ways to keep in shape and do our sporting activities was to sign up as members of a local gym. One night, a few of us went to the gym to play basketball. There were several middle-aged men on the court when we arrived, so we challenged them to a full-court game. The men were better players than we were, but we had youthful energy and lots of crazy enthusiasm on our side. We ran up and down the court, and the older men had difficulty keeping up with us. The game had been going on for a while when someone from our office came and said that the Red Cross had called us. A nearby river had flooded, and they wanted us to join their disaster relief team. "Sorry, we have to go now," we told the panting, sweating middle-aged men. As we were leaving, I saw one of them lying on his back, letting his breathing come back to normal. I'm pretty sure they were very happy to see us leave. When we returned to our office, we got another call from the Red Cross, and they said that the flood wasn't as bad as they had feared and that we need not come to the disaster scene. Sadvipra, the Journal of Social and Spiritual Progress. During my first weeks in Wichita, I collected material for the newspaper, but I was kind of stalling until I got a wake-up call. Ananda Marga had become very controversial in India at this time. The organization first started out as a small regional yoga movement in the state of Bihar in eastern India. In the early 1960s, Baba created an order of monks and nuns, and they spread the spiritual teachings to the far-flung corners of India. They also set up schools, clinics, and other social service units. Spirituality combined with social service was a good combination, and it proved popular. However, Baba also formulated a theory of social change, known as the Progressive Utilization Theory, better known by its acronym PROUT. PROUT challenged both capitalism and communism. I first heard about PROUT when the artist in the yoga house in Palo Alto referred to a political party, and later on I started to read Baba's books dealing with social issues. I was deeply inspired by PROUT, but in India, Ananda Marga was acquiring powerful enemies, especially among the communists who saw Prout as a rival and a threat to their drive to win the allegiance of young people looking for an alternative to capitalism. The left-leaning central government of India became wary of Ananda Marga, as did the communist-run state government of West Bengal. To combat the rise of Ananda Marga, the government concocted false cases against Baba, and on the last day of December 1971, Baba was arrested. When I heard that Baba had been arrested, I was not happy, but I was not overly worried either. We knew about political prisoners in the U.S. In New York and California, one commonly saw placards calling on the government to free various civil rights leaders, American Indian activists, and many others. Very soon, we would be adding Free Baba posters to the spectrum of human rights protests in the U.S. and abroad. The justice system moves a lot more slowly in India than in other parts of the world, and it was only in September 1972 that Baba's trial had begun in earnest. Newspaper coverage in India was widespread. When I saw all the Indian newspapers and even a few international articles about Baba's trial, I knew that it was time to swing into action to present our side of the story. I gathered all my articles together and produced the first issue of Sadvipra, the Journal of Social and Spiritual Progress. It was a 12-page tabloid newspaper. The lead article was about the start of Baba's trial and included a picture of him. There were also essays and articles on spirituality, book reviews, vegetarian recipes, interviews, spiritual comic strips, and other feature articles. Over the next few years, this monthly newspaper became relatively popular, and it paid for itself in subscriptions and advertisements. I used to send copies of the newspaper to India, to Baba, and he read it and even made comments about it. Here's an example. One time, he was reading the newspaper and he came upon one of our advertisements. A woman in California was sewing and selling special yogic underwear for men, known as lungotas. She advertised it for the price of $2.50 per unit. Baba looked at the price and said, "$2.50? What, are they made out of gold?" In India at that time, the price of a lungota would have been 5 to 10 times cheaper. Another time, I delayed putting out a monthly issue and combined 2 issues into one. Someone came back from India and told me that Baba had said Sadvipra must come out on the same day each month. Editing and publishing the newspaper was tedious work and kept me very busy. In those days, our procedure was as follows. We would type the articles, I would sometimes have 1 or 2 assistants, and then bring them to a newspaper plant where they had a typesetting machine. When the typesetting work was done, we would get the articles back in the form of long strips containing columns of type that we would then cut and lay out, attaching the columns by smearing melted wax on the back of the strips and affixing them to a layout grid. We had to cut and paste everything. This was before the era of desktop publishing on the computer, and it sometimes got confusing and messy. We did most of the work in our own office, but on the last day, when the newspaper was to be delivered to the printer for offset printing, we went into the newspaper plant to put on the headlines and do the final layout of the columns of type, photos, drawings, and advertisements. This last day was always the most tedious because of the complexity involved trying to get everything to fit. Once I was in the newspaper plant and I was taking too much time getting everything ready. The plant owner was annoyed and wanted to go home. He came into the area where I was working and said that he would help me by sending one of his workers to assist me. I was laying out an article that described the yogic chakras, the energy centers situated in the spine. There was a label for each of the 7 chakras, and they had to be positioned by hand in the right place. Somehow, the newspaper assistant got involved in this process, and when we got the printed newspaper back, all the labels were in the wrong positions. I and one assistant had to fix it by gluing a correctly labeled chakra diagram on 5,000 newspapers. My assistant looked at me and said, "Is this the way it's going to be with every issue?" "No," I said very sternly. We continued to publish the newspaper every month, shifting our office from the garage in the yoga house to a room in a commercial print shop that Ananda Marga had set up in Wichita. Each month, we printed close to 5,000 newspapers. Some would be sent to individual subscribers, and some were sent in bundles to the various Ananda Marga centers in the U.S. The subscription price was $3 for 12 issues, and somehow checks were arriving in the mail every day. I was able to pay for the cost of printing and mailing the paper from the subscription payments for bulk copies, advertisements, and occasional donations. I'm for evolution. Shortly after the first issue of Sadvipra was published, I heard that the Margis of Lawrence were organizing a lecture for Ram Dass at the University of Kansas. I traveled to Lawrence because I knew that it would be a good opportunity to write an article about Ram Dass and perhaps get a chance to interview him. Baba's trial in India was weighing on my mind, and I wanted to find out if Ram Dass, who was by this time quite a celebrity, could help us in any way. The Margis in Lawrence were university students, and their apartment was the center for Ananda Marga activities. They hosted a weekly collective meditation session, and from time to time they organized lectures on the university campus for Ananda Marga speakers, and in this case, for Ram Dass. I reached their apartment shortly before the lecture was to begin, and after a short time I had a chance to speak with Ram Dass privately. He was seated on the floor in a small room, and he had a confident, self-assured presence. I sat down facing him and introduced myself. After a short time, I started talking about Baba's imprisonment. It's important for spiritual people to speak up and not allow Baba to be persecuted in this way, I said. Ram Dass looked at me intently and replied, "As I understand it, in India, Ananda Marga stands somewhere between revolution and evolution, and I'm for evolution." I got the message. Ram Dass was not about to get involved in this matter, so I went on talking about other things. That night, Ram Dass gave an inspiring lecture with chanting, similar to the one in Palo Alto that had been instrumental in preparing me for my first meeting with an Ananda Marga teacher. I went back to Wichita and wrote an article about the lecture. Although Ram Dass did not speak out publicly on behalf of Baba, one of his subsequent books had a section in which the main spiritual movements in America were described, and in that section there was a positive entry for Ananda Marga. Also, some years later in Washington, D.C., I attended one of Ram Dass's public lectures, and at the end of the lecture, I gave him a copy of our newspaper. He took it and gave me a warm smile. Meeting Mrs. Gandhi in Ottawa, Canada. During the spring of 1973, I found out that India's Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, was going to pay a special visit to Ottawa. As Baba was still being held prisoner in an Indian jail, several Margis wanted to go to Ottawa to let Mrs. Gandhi know how we felt about Baba's imprisonment. I also learned that it was possible to get press credentials and enter the corps of reporters and broadcasters who would be covering the visit of India's Prime Minister. Using the letterhead of the Sadvipra newspaper, I applied and was accepted into the team of accredited print and broadcast journalists. Margis from different parts of the U.S. and Canada went to Ottawa planning to hold public demonstrations that would draw attention to Baba's imprisonment. I took a bus from Wichita to Detroit and then to Ottawa. When I arrived in Ottawa, I went to the press headquarters for the Prime Minister's visit and was given complete information about the two-day program. An important piece of information was the places where the Prime Minister would visit during her stay in Ottawa. With this information, the Margis were able to organize demonstrations whenever Mrs. Gandhi appeared in public. Margis held free Baba signs and the usual kinds of placards displayed in such demonstrations. But what added zest to the whole thing was the street theater. One Margi sister wore an Indian sari, and her hair had the characteristic gray-silver streak that Mrs. Gandhi was known for. The street theater showed Mrs. Gandhi presiding over a regime where protesters were beaten and thrown into jail. This was no exaggeration, because within the next 2 years, Mrs. Gandhi declared a state of emergency in India, suspended democratic liberties, and imprisoned thousands of dissenters on all sides of the political spectrum. The organizers of Mrs. Gandhi's visit were surprised at the quantity of demonstrations because many of her outings in the Canadian capital had not been announced to the public. Everywhere she went, the Margis were there. For me, the highlight of the event was a press conference in which Mrs. Gandhi took questions from the journalists. As an accredited journalist, I attended the conference. When the question and answer session came, I knew I would have a chance to ask her about Baba and Ananda Marga. Just prior to the press conference, we came to know that the persecution of Ananda Marga in India had intensified, and even some Ananda Marga relief projects in a drought-stricken area of India had been shut down by the government. With this on my mind, I carefully framed a question and raised my hand. As my raised hand was acknowledged and I rose to speak, I was reminded of a similar incident during my last year of college when a representative of the U.S. State Department came to my campus to explain why the U.S. was waging war in Vietnam. I took part in a small meeting with this State Department official, and when the question and answer period began, I asked him whether this war was necessary for the defense of the U.S. or if it was being waged for the benefit of vested interest groups. My question was sharply worded and delivered with a lot of zest, and afterward, one of my professors came up to me to express his surprise at my frank remarks. This time it was not a small room with a State Department official, but a large conference room with Mrs. Gandhi at the podium. I asked her why Ananda Marga social service projects had been closed, and why P.R. Sarkar was being held as a political prisoner. She replied the P.R. Sarkar was not a political prisoner, but was charged with serious crimes. When the press conference ended, one of the journalists, who by now had realized that I was not an actual journalist, came up to me and said, "Are you satisfied now?" "Yes," I replied. Without a doubt, the long bus journey and the hectic 2 days in Ottawa had been well worth it. I moved to Washington, D.C. In September 1973, several people suggested that I would have a better opportunity to develop the newspaper by moving the office to Washington, D.C. In Washington, a large house had just been donated to Ananda Marga, so I would have a place to stay and work. At the same time that I moved to Washington, several other Margis made the move. They set up a training center in the same house where I would be editing the newspaper. This was to be a training center for the education, relief, and welfare section of Ananda Marga, where young volunteers would learn Ananda Marga spiritual practices and get a chance to perfect their meditation practice while also working in the field of social service. The training center was in the upper part of the house, and my newspaper office was in the basement. 10 to 15 trainees were living upstairs, young men and women from all over the U.S. They did a lot of meditation and chanting, creating a wonderful spiritual atmosphere. During this time, I began to play kirtan and other spiritual songs more and more, and my guitar playing, which I had begun in 1966, was improving. Some months later, in the early part of 1974, I moved from the training center to a shared house in another part of Washington. And here is Prakash Lofer and Dada Veda in the picture. My newspaper office moved with me, and a ping pong table in the basement of this house became my layout table. 1974 was a year of considerable growth for the Sadvipra newspaper. I participated in cooperative mailings with the East-West Journal, a large New England-based alternative periodical, and our subscriber base increased substantially, going beyond the confines of Ananda Marga. The newspaper continued to feature articles on meditation and yoga, with one of Baba's articles appearing in each issue. There were also articles on martial arts, popular culture, and book reviews that seemed to appeal to our new readership. After a few months in the shared house, I found an even better place for the newspaper office. A progressive church rented me an office in the Adams Morgan neighborhood. Adams Morgan was the alternative section of Washington, D.C. When you think of Washington, you might think of the White House and the Capitol building, but not far from these iconic buildings lay a poor neighborhood populated by minorities and young radicals. Food cooperatives and activist organizations made their home here, and so did the Sadvipra newspaper in a one-room office. When we were in Wichita, we used to print the newspaper in a local newspaper plant that published several weekly newspapers, most notably an Air Force-based newspaper. In Washington, D.C., we found a newspaper plant in Maryland that primarily printed the Carroll County Times. It was a long drive from Washington, but they gave us the lowest price. Our routine was much the same as in Wichita. We would do a lot of the work in our own office, but on the day when we brought everything to the printer for submission, there was still a lot to be done, such as adding the headlines, getting the photos and illustrations processed, and submitting last-minute articles that were typeset right there at the plant and then hurriedly inserted into the layout. We would sometimes spend as much as 12 hours at the newspaper plant. After we submitted everything, we waited and watched as the paper rolled off the huge presses. It looked almost miraculous as the large press rolled out the paper, printed the pages on both sides, and then cut and folded the newspaper into neat bundles. Then we stuffed the papers in our van or car and drove back to Washington in the wee hours of the morning. One night at the Carroll County Times stands out in my memory. I was working with the printer trying to get the photographs just right. They used to process the photographs by putting them under a special reproduction camera and producing a grayscale negative with the dot pattern that you see if you look closely at printed images in newspapers. These negatives were then stripped into the layout, and the whole thing was again photographed and made into a plate. It was after midnight, and we were working with such intense concentration trying to finish everything that we didn't notice everyone else leaving the newspaper plant. Eventually, we found out there had been a bomb threat made to the owners of the printing plant. It seemed that a mob or criminal elements had been trying to coerce the plant owners into dropping the newspaper of one of their rivals. I didn't care about any bomb. I just wanted to finish the newspaper, and I wouldn't let the printer quit either. At one point, he just looked at me and said, "I don't even know why I'm doing this for you." Being the devotee that I was, I just thought he's doing it because it is for Baba's mission. Later, we shifted our printing to a newspaper plant in Silver Springs, a suburb adjacent to Washington, D.C. It was closer to our office and made things easier. Universal Times and Proudest Forum of America. I had started the Sadvipra newspaper at the request of Dada Veda, who I believe was trying to replicate the kind of activity that Ananda Marga was doing in India, but there were some differences between our paper and those in India. In the US, it was not really economical or practical to print a newspaper on our own presses. To produce a tabloid newspaper, you needed a printing press that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, while the Indian Ananda Marga papers were often printed on our own presses located in our offices. Another difference between what I was doing and the work that was going on in India is that many of the newspapers that the Margis published there were not newspapers focused on spiritual matters, but rather analyzed the news from the perspective of Prout, the progressive utilization theory. I actually wanted to do something similar in the US. I was keenly interested in Prout right from the beginning. Just before I got into Ananda Marga, I was propelled by two forces. I was attracted to spirituality, but I was also dissatisfied with the war and other social problems and was looking for progressive social change. I reached Ananda Marga first because of my desire to learn meditation, but I was happy to know that the guru also had something to say about society and that his social message was in line with my bent of mind. Now, I really wanted to spread Prout's concepts of economic democracy and social justice far and wide. I wanted to produce a newspaper that would be based on a Proutist perspective of the world, so I decided to alter the course of the newspaper. We changed the name to the Universal Times, and I even started a separate organization, the Proudest Forum of America, which I registered as a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. We chose that name to emulate the Proudest Forum of India. Though we continued to publish spiritual and cultural articles, the Universal Times concentrated more on social issues. Living in Washington, I was able to meet and get contributions from some notable people. At that time, Coleman McCarthy was a columnist for the Washington Post. He was an interesting person who had started his career as a Trappist monk before becoming a peace activist, a journalist, and later a university professor. He was a deeply spiritual person with a strong social conscience, and his columns at the Washington Post were not like the usual newspaper opinion editorial essays. I met him because he was a member of the church that owned the building where my newspaper office was located. Shortly after we met, he began contributing articles to the Universal Times every few months. During the time I was in Washington, publishing Sadvipra and the Universal Times, we also published an exclusive interview with Black Panther leader Huey Newton, who told of his experiences with meditation while being held in solitary confinement. I also went to a meeting with the late economist John Kenneth Galbraith and wrote an article about him. My attendance at a press conference with consumer advocate and activist Ralph Nader allowed me to write an article that we put on the front page of our paper along with Nader's photo. Someone told me that when they gave the newspaper to Nader, he was beaming. In addition to meeting the columnist Coleman McCarthy, my work on the Universal Times allowed me to meet other notable journalists. During this period, I attended a journalist convention in New York City organized by a short-lived trade publication. One of the main speakers was the newsman Mike Wallace. He was known for his no-nonsense interviews of public figures on his weekly television broadcast. After his presentation, I ran into him in the lobby and began to tell him about Baba. When I told that Baba had been fasting for 3 years in protest against a poisoning attempt on his life while in prison, he said, "3 years? Jesus Christ!" Making a living. When I was in Wichita, Dada Y had said that now I was living on Baba Nam Kevalam. That was only partly correct because when I moved to Washington, D.C., I needed to raise a small amount of money each month for my personal expenses. By that time, I had become a fairly good typist, churning out articles for the various Ananda Marga newsletters and the Sadvipra newspaper. Back in high school, I had also taken a course in touch typing, so that course, combined with a lot of practice, turned me into a professional typist. Well, I was not quite professional yet, but I went to a temporary work agency in Washington, D.C. and was given a typing test. I barely passed, but the firm took me on anyway, and they soon gave me temporary assignments in various commercial offices in the Washington area. I would work a few days a week, enough for me to get by. The expenses of the newspaper were paid via a steady stream of subscriptions and payments for bulk orders from Ananda Marga centers around the country. In addition to temporary office work, I also was able to earn some money on spot jobs that some of my fellow Margies organized. One of our brothers was working with a theater company in Washington, and one day he came to the Jagrati and said that the company was looking for some caterers to supply some meals for the cast of a musical. I and a few other Margies volunteered to take the job. That first weekend, we prepared an elaborate vegetarian meal for the cast. They said that they liked it, but some of them insisted on having meat. The next weekend, we prepared a chicken dinner, but it just did not feel right to be handling the parts of a dead animal in order to make a living. We resigned from the job after that weekend. More interesting than the catering job was the valet parking business that one enterprising Margie, Bruce, started. He organized small groups of young men to park the cars of celebrities and politicians at fancy Washington parties, and sometimes invited residents of the Jagrati to take part. The parties were held in private homes and mansions in the Northern Virginia suburbs adjacent to Washington, D.C. I had heard that our valet parking crew had worked a party for Senator Ted Kennedy one weekend, and I was hoping to get a glimpse of something similar. I soon got my chance. One night I parked cars for guests at a party at the home of Lady Bird Johnson and her family. Mrs. Johnson was the wife of the late President Lyndon B. Johnson and lived near Washington with her daughter Linda and her son-in-law Charles Robb, who eventually became the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia as well as a two-term U.S. Senator. Though we parked many cars for guests that night, some of whom must have been well-known public figures, I did not recognize anyone. However, at the end of the party, Mrs. Johnson invited the parking team into the house and gave us some refreshments. She personally shook the hand of each of us. As she was shaking the hand of my friend Ram Kumar, I felt that it was very ironic. Ram was the head of our Prout department, and she was a symbol of the establishment. If she only knew with whom she is shaking hands, I thought. But for her, Ram was just a nice young man who had contributed to the success of the party, and the handshake was a pleasant end to the evening. Bruce didn't stop with the valet parking at parties. He soon landed the parking concession at the Pisces Club, a popular downtown Washington destination for the area's rich and famous. I was told that singer and social activist Eartha Kitt sometimes visited the club, as did various politicians. One night I was on duty in the parking lot of the Pisces Club when a giant American sedan, of the type that was popular before gasoline prices started to rise in the 1970s, roared into the parking lot. The parking lot was not exactly level. There was an incline and then a dip at the entrance to the lot. The sedan that came in was going too fast, and the underside of the car scraped against the bump, causing sparks to fly. It was not a serious problem, but I was surprised when the car door opened and out stepped Senator John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth and a huge public hero. I looked at him, and he looked at me with the glance that said, "Yeah, I know that you recognize me." He smiled, and I parked his car. That was another ironic meeting. The man who orbited the Earth without a hitch had difficulty with the bump at the Pisces Club parking lot. The Free Baba Movement. During my years at Washington, D.C., one of the ongoing Ananda Marga activities was the Free Baba Movement. In those days, there were all kinds of movements to free protesters and political prisoners in the U.S., so for us it was not a big problem to organize a movement focused on getting justice for our imprisoned guru. A few Margis moved to Washington and set up a small Free Baba office in our center. They contacted the news media, organized demonstrations, and even lobbied the U.S. Congress, trying to get our government to take a stand and apply some pressure on the Indian government. In this connection, they launched a campaign to contact each and every U.S. Senator and member of the House of Representatives. There are 435 representatives and 100 senators, so it was no small undertaking. They enlisted the help of various Margis to go around and personally visit the offices of the senators and representatives, and I was one of them. I went to several offices and recounted the story of Baba's imprisonment in India to the secretaries who were working for the congressman. They listened intently, especially because we noted that Baba was being persecuted by communists and a left-leaning government in India. During those Cold War years, all you had to do was say communist, and all ears would perk up. As a result of this campaign, several U.S. senators, including the former presidential candidate George McGovern, wrote letters to the Indian government asking them to review Baba's case. The organizers of the Free Baba campaign also informed me that several of my visits to Capitol Hill had been successful, and that many of the offices that I contacted responded with letters to the Indian government. In addition to the lobbying activity, the Free Baba campaign also organized big public rallies in Washington during the time that I was there. One of them came shortly after I moved into the Jagriti. We learned that Baba had been poisoned by a jail doctor in India, and that as a result he was fasting until the Indian government mounted a probe into the incident. Then a rumor came from India that as a result of the fast, Baba's physical condition was deteriorating. That rumor was all it took to bring hundreds of Margis to Washington to hold a public rallying bringing attention to Baba's plight. And here's a picture of the demonstration in Washington, D.C., 1973. Dada Veda is standing to the right of the monk, dressed in a sports jacket. You see him? Our Jagriti was a big 2-story house, but it was not capable of holding hundreds of people. We crammed as many as we could into the house, and the rest of the Margis stayed in places around the city that we had arranged for them. In the summer of 1975, the Free Baba campaign organized a Universal Freedom March, and again hundreds of Margis poured into Washington to demonstrate on behalf of Baba. The march took place in the middle of August when the government was in recess, so it probably didn't accomplish much, but we Margi participants were energized by it. Despite the meager attention paid to our public demonstrations, the Free Baba campaign actually had some significant successes to its credit. The previously mentioned lobbying of Congress was important, as were reports about Baba's imprisonment given by impartial and respected jurists and human rights representatives who were commissioned by our offices. One of these reports was delivered by a Canadian jurist who represented the International Commission of Jurists. His name was Claude Armand Shepard. He traveled to India during the time when Mrs. Gandhi had declared a state of emergency. He noted that Baba's trial was being conducted in an atmosphere of fear because someone coming forward to testify on Baba's behalf could be subject to imprisonment under the draconian provisions of the state of emergency in which almost all opponents of Mrs. Gandhi were stuck behind bars. He said that it was impossible for someone like Baba to have a free and fair trial under these circumstances. Shepard's report was delivered before a Congressional Human Rights Committee, and I was there in attendance along with a few other Margis. Can I vote for you guys this year? In 1976, I began to tour, giving lectures at college campuses and at Ananda Marga seminars. I spoke about different aspects of the progressive utilization theory and how it applied to the economic and political situation in the U.S. and the world. At Princeton University in New Jersey, Professor Richard Falk, a well-known professor of international law, ran a unique seminar in which he invited representatives with different social and religious perspectives to give their vision of what the world would be like in the next 100 years. Professor Falk was already in contact with us, contributing articles to our Renaissance Universal Journal, and he invited us to send a speaker to his seminar class. I attended the seminar as a guest speaker, arriving by train, where I was met by some students who helped Professor Falk organize his lecture series. We went to the university cafeteria to have a meal before the class. I was tempted to have some ice cream for dessert, but abstained, remembering that Baba advised not eating sweets before a public talk or performance. I spoke about the social cycle, the theory that history can be understood as a rotation of eras in which a particular class of people, defined by their psychological type, dominate each of the eras. In my presentation, I traced a sweeping view of history, showing how an era of survival-minded primitive humans in the Old Stone Age gave way to an age of warriors and monarchs, followed by an age of intellectuals and priests during the Middle Ages, and then to the present period dominated by capitalists. Taking my cue from Baba's book, Human Society, I predicted that this present era would culminate with revolution, followed by the establishment of a new economic and political system based on moral leadership. Professor Falk commented that he saw similarities with Marx's theory of history. Professor Falk was indeed right, but in my reply to his comment, I did my best to show that there were important differences between my presentation of the social cycle and the Marxist view of history. Marx, I replied, predicted that in the last stage of capitalism, there would be a few people with a lot of wealth and that they would be confronted by an angry mass of what he called the proletariat, who would rise up and overthrow the system. However, he did not consider that amongst the revolutionary mass there would be intellectuals and warriors as well as laborers, and that this would have an important influence on the society that was built after this upheaval. Prior to my visit to Professor Falk's seminar, a representative of the Baha'i faith had given a presentation there, and due to this, one of the students asked me if the leaders of the coming new era would all be Ananda Margis. From the Baha'i lecture, he got the feeling that the Baha'is believed that the future world would be a Baha'i world, and that is why he wanted to get a better picture of what we were thinking. I thought about the question and then said, the leaders in the future will be diverse, but they will be united by adherence to a basic moral code. Another challenging campus visit took place at Bucknell University in central Pennsylvania. A Margi student, Brian, was in his senior year at the college and was the main organizer for an event that brought a wide variety of speakers to the campus. Brian told me I would be speaking in the class of his political science professor, who said he was a Marxist. I was worried about how this talk would go. Though Prout does have similarities with Marxism, it is basically a theory of economics and government that is dependent on a spiritual view of the world, and this, I imagine, could cause friction with a hardline Marxist. So I entered the classroom with some uneasiness. Much to my relief, the professor was friendly, and he and his students were really interested in what I had to say. Later in the day, I attended another session on campus in which that same professor was giving a recap of progressive movements working in the U.S., and he favorably mentioned Prout. Another stop on my campus tour was the University of Rochester in New York State, where a Margi professor often invited Ananda Marga speakers to give talks to her students. On the day I was scheduled to speak, my acharya, Dada Veda, was present. He whispered to me, "Speak about the 6 spokes of society." I was referring to 6 basic factors that Baba said were needed to build a healthy society. I thought that this topic might be difficult to do in a university setting, but I launched into it, mentioning the factors and giving examples from both history and contemporary events. The lecture was well received, and I was starting to become more confident about presenting our social philosophy to diverse audiences. In addition to the university lectures, I also spoke about Prout as Margi gatherings. I was invited to a small Ananda Marga retreat in New Haven, Connecticut, and gave a general introduction to Prout. When the retreat was finished, I traveled back from New Haven to Washington by train, and on the way I got another chance to see how our social ideas would fly with the public. Seated next to me on the train was a middle-aged woman, and we struck up a conversation. She asked what I did, and I started to tell her about the Universal Times and Prout. Since we were in the midst of the 1976 presidential election campaign, she was interested to hear about my political and social views. "What is the essence of Prout?" she asked. "We want economic democracy and government by people who are truly working for the well-being of the public and not for their own personal interest," I began. "What do you mean by economic democracy?" she asked. "Well, this year people can vote for the president, but they may not be able to vote about things that directly affect their working environment," I began. "Suppose someone works in a factory and that factory is owned by a corporation. That worker has no say about who sits on the board of directors, even though that board of directors can decide to shut down the factory and thus terminate that worker's employment. How would you change this?" "We believe that most enterprises should be set up in the form of worker-owned and managed cooperatives. The workers would have a vote in deciding who sits on the management board and would get a share of the profits. They would be stakeholders in the business, and this would increase productivity." "But haven't such cooperatives been a tremendous failure in the Soviet Union and the communist countries of Eastern Europe?" she countered. "The so-called cooperatives in the Soviet Union are not true cooperatives," I replied. "They are really enterprises owned by the central government in Moscow and managed by corrupt party officials. The workers have little to no say about what goes on, so it is no wonder that these firms are notoriously inefficient. There's a professor at Cornell University, Yaroslav Vanek, whose studies of true worker-managed firms show that they can be more efficient than companies owned by corporations." "But surely you wouldn't expect all the enterprises in a country to be owned and run by cooperatives," the woman said. "That's correct," I continued. "It would be best if the economy were set up in 3 tiers. Very small enterprises with few employees and dealing with non-essential goods and services could be run as privately owned sole proprietorships and partnerships. This would constitute the first tier of the economy. The guy selling peanuts or ice cream outside the park could continue with his business. However, larger businesses with more than a handful of employees should be organized as cooperatives. These cooperatives would make up the second tier. What's the third tier? She asked. The large key industries with many employees handling transportation, communications, mineral extraction, and other tasks that have a huge impact on the overall economy should be publicly managed either by a state government in a federal system like the U.S. or by a public board in countries where they do not have strong local governments. These are the third tier. I looked out the window and saw that we were already in New Jersey, but the conversation was not over. We were just getting warmed up. Wouldn't this third tier of state-owned businesses end up with the same inefficiencies as the enterprises in the Soviet Union? The woman said. In the Soviet Union, the enterprises are not run by local governments. They are run by the central government in Moscow, which is often out of touch with local conditions. Their whole approach is to concentrate economic and political power at one point. The difference in Proud is that we want a decentralized economy in which regions would be able to develop in a diverse way with a proper mix of industry, agriculture, and services. In addition, economic planning would be done at the local level and not in a distant political capital. It sounds good, she said, as the train passed a blighted neighborhood beside the train track, but how would you cope with poverty and inequality? This is supposed to be the richest country on earth, and yet we have lots of poverty, I replied. Ensuring that every single person has the minimum necessities of life is the duty of a healthy society. We cannot leave this task to the ups and downs of the market system. Are you advocating some kind of welfare system where everybody gets a monthly check, allowing them to buy what they need? She inquired. Not at all, I said. The government can't just dole out money. That would just make people lazy. We need an economy that will provide people with jobs that will enable everyone to earn enough money to live with dignity. But why don't we have this kind of economy right now? All the presidential candidates say they are for full employment, the woman said. Under capitalism, full employment actually means 4 or 5% unemployment. Ask any economist and they will tell you that the economy needs some slack so that there will not be inflation. Some slack may be okay for the economists or the politicians, but if you are part of the 4 or 5% that remains unemployed, it won't be okay for you. On top of that, what good is full employment if many of those jobs come with salaries that don't give a person the purchasing capacity that he or she needs to get the minimum necessities of life? Clearly, we can't go on with business as usual. People talk about waging a war on poverty and about minimum wage laws and providing a floor beneath which no one should be allowed to sink. However, no one talks about a ceiling for the economic house. What do you mean by a ceiling? She asked, somewhat perplexed. It is the concentration of vast wealth in the hands of a tiny few that is behind most of the problems we've been talking about. We quibble about whether the minimum wage should be raised from $2.30 an hour to $2.50 an hour, but no one says anything about whether we need a maximum wage or a cap on total wealth accumulation. I think we need some kind of a rational ceiling on wealth holdings so that the gap between the poorest and the richest is not too great, and so that wealthy people do not have a disproportionate amount of influence on the political system. If rational and moral people put their heads together, they can solve any problem that we are currently facing or will face in the future. However, if major decisions are left in the hands of the most selfish people on the planet, then we are doomed. The train was pulling into Union Station in Washington, so we had to bring our conversation to some kind of conclusion. I was not sure how well I had conveyed the proudest view of contemporary events, but I was pleasantly surprised when my traveling companion said, "Can I vote for you guys this year?" "We're not on the ballot this year," I replied, "but sometime in the future you will get a chance to vote for us." And that concludes chapter 3. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed chapter 2 and chapter 3 of Dada Veda's spiritual memoir, From Brooklyn to Benares and Back. Dada Veda is still here in the chat if anyone has any questions for him. December's clapping. Thank you, thank you. This really is fascinating stuff, Dada Veda. I'm enjoying every minute of it. Can't wait till next week to read more. Any final questions or comments? I think Teresa's clapping. Oh, Teresa just got a raffle ticket. Let me screenshot that. Oh, 2 raffle tickets for Teresa. Oh, and there's one for Meta. All right. 1 for Meta, 2 for Teresa. Screenshot. I didn't even know Meta was here. Oh, check it out. Dada Veda is streaming tonight on Twitch at 7 p.m. Central. That's 8 p.m. Eastern for anybody who wants to check out Dada Veda's amazing music. All right. If nobody else has any questions or comments, I'm going to wrap it up. And don't forget, this will be available as a replay on my YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any content. There is a playlist called From Brooklyn to Benares and Back on my YouTube channel, where you can catch chapter 1 from last week and the replay of chapter 2 and 3 from today, which will be there in the next couple of hours. So thank you all for being here. Look forward to seeing you again next week. And make sure you attend Dada Veda's stream tonight. It's going to be awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Namaskar.